Rome commanded legions, laws, and half the known earth. But one piece of fabric unsettled its proudest senators completely. It wasn't a weapon, a plague, or a rival empire. It was two simple tubes of cloth stitched together. Historians call it trousers, but Rome called it the enemy of civilization. Welcome back to the channel where forgotten systems of history come alive through immersive reconstruction. Today, we uncover why Rome, master of conquest, architecture, and law, viewed a simple pair of pants as a mark of savagery, and how that prejudice quietly shaped politics, warfare, and identity for centuries. If hidden secrets like this fascinate you, hit subscribe now, drop a comment with the mystery you want uncovered next, and smash that like button so more forgotten history reaches curious minds like yours. The investigation begins now. I stand at the edge of the Roman Forum, wind cutting through the columns, and I feel it before I see it, a stranger walking toward the Senate steps, legs wrapped in cloth instead of bare beneath a toga. The murmurs start instantly. To modern eyes, trousers seem harmless, practical, even obvious. But in Rome, clothing was never just clothing. It was a coded language, a visual system that told every citizen exactly who held power and who did not. The toga was not comfortable. It was heavy, restrictive, nearly impossible to work in. That was the point. Only a man with servants, leisure, and status could afford to wear something so useless for labor. Trousers, by contrast, belonged to horsemen, hunters, and warriors from the cold northern frontiers, Gauls, Germans, Parthians. People who rode, fought, and moved through harsh terrain where a flowing toga would mean death. So when Romans saw pants, they weren't just seeing fabric. They were seeing an entire worldview they had spent centuries defining themselves against: mobility over stillness, function over formality, frontier over forum. I walk closer, imagining the reconstructed scene sharpening around me. A senator's eyes narrow, not out of curiosity, but calculation. This is a threat to a system, not a person. Roman identity had been built like architecture, deliberate, layered, load-bearing. Remove one visual pillar, like the toga's dominance, and the entire structure of civilized versus barbarian begins to wobble. This is why Julius Caesar, centuries later, would write with visible unease about the trouser-wearing tribes beyond the Rhine. Not because pants made them stronger, but because pants made them different in a way Rome could not categorize. And categorization was Rome's greatest weapon. An empire cannot rule diverse peoples without first sorting them: citizen or foreigner, civilized or savage, toga or trouser. What I'm uncovering isn't a story about clothing. It's a story about how an empire engineered identity itself, and how one forbidden garment threatened to unravel it. I move deeper into the reconstruction, and the scene shifts to something colder, more official, a courtroom, or what passed for one. Because this isn't just about mockery anymore. This is about legislation. In the 4th century, as barbarian styles crept into Roman cities through trade, migration, and military recruitment, the imperial government did something remarkable. It banned trousers by law within the walls of Rome itself. I stand before the imagined edict, its Latin phrasing sharp and defensive. Wearing barbarian clothing inside the city was treated as a violation of Roman order, punishable by exile from Roman spaces. Think about what that means. An empire so vast it stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia felt threatened enough by fabric to write it into law. That isn't fashion policy. That's fear of erosion from within. By this point, Rome's own army was filling with soldiers from Germanic and Gallic tribes, men who had worn trousers their entire lives, now defending the very civilization that despised their clothing. I picture a Roman general reviewing his troops, half of them technically breaking dress code the moment they stepped off the battlefield and into the city gates. This contradiction reveals something historians rarely emphasize. Rome needed the barbarians it claimed to despise. Its legions, its frontiers, even its emperors increasingly depended on the very cultures its laws tried to erase. The trouser ban wasn't really about barbarians outside Rome. It was about barbarian influence already living inside Rome's institutions, and a desperate attempt to draw a line that no longer existed. I imagine the reaction of a soldier told to change clothes before entering the city he risked his life defending. Humiliation dressed up as tradition. And this is where the real mystery deepens. Because if Rome's identity depended on rejecting trousers, what happens when the empire itself starts falling apart at the very seams it tried so hard to protect? I cross an invisible boundary in the reconstruction, and the marble of Rome dissolves into mud, pine forests, and river fog, the Rhine frontier, where Roman soldiers stood facing the very people they had legally condemned. Here, trousers weren't a statement, they were survival. Winters that froze rivers solid, terrain that shredded sandals, horseback combat that demanded flexibility. This was a world the toga was never built for. I watch as Roman soldiers, forced by climate rather than ideology, begin adopting the very garments their government banned back home. Faragne, braque, the Latin words for trousers, start appearing more often in military records. This is the quiet contradiction historians love to skip past. On the frontier, practicality always defeats propaganda. Soldiers who mocked barbarian dress in the forum were secretly grateful for it in the field. I picture a centurion, hands numb from cold, pulling on trousers beneath his armor where no senator could see. Comfort became rebellion, disguised as necessity. Meanwhile, the tribes across the river weren't primitive at all. Their trousers were engineered, reinforced seams, wool weaves suited for movement, designs refined over generations of survival in brutal climates. Rome, obsessed with categorizing itself as superior, had failed to notice that its barbarian neighbors had solved a problem Roman fashion never even attempted to fix. This reframes everything. The line between civilized and savage wasn't about intelligence or capability, it was about geography, climate, and whose innovations were considered worth admitting. I imagine the moment a Roman general finally authorizes trousers for troops stationed in Gaul and Germania, quietly, without fanfare, because losing soldiers to frostbite mattered more than losing face. And that's when the deeper pattern emerges. Rome wasn't defeated by barbarian armies alone. It was slowly, silently reshaped by barbarian practicality, one frozen frontier at a time. I return to the capital, but something has changed. The reconstruction now shows mosaics, statues, and imperial portraits from centuries after the trouser ban, and the men in them are no longer wearing togas. By the late Roman Empire, emperors themselves began appearing in tight-fitting tunics paired with leggings, a style borrowed directly from the very frontier cultures Rome once legislated against. I stand before an imagined portrait of Emperor Honorius, his clothing a quiet confession that the empire's old rules no longer matched its new reality. This wasn't weakness, it was adaptation. As Rome's power depended more heavily on Germanic generals, Gallic cavalry, and frontier-born soldiers, the culture at the top had no choice but to absorb the culture at the edges. I imagine court officials debating in hushed tones, how does an empire maintain the illusion of superiority while quietly adopting the customs of those it claims to rule? The answer, as always in Rome, was rebranding. Trousers worn by emperors weren't called barbarian anymore. They were reframed as military fashion, a symbol of strength rather than submission. This is the moment the mystery sharpens into something bigger than clothing. It becomes a story about how empires rewrite their own values the instant survival requires it. I picture a senator, old and rigid in his traditional toga, watching younger nobles adopt trousers openly, powerlessly witnessing the world he defended dissolve in real time. What once symbolized savagery had become, almost overnight, a marker of elite military identity, proof that cultural boundaries are never fixed, only temporarily enforced. And so the empire that once banned trousers by law was now, generation by generation, being reshaped by the very people it swore were beneath it, a quiet takeover no army ever needed to fight. I stand now at the empire's final chapter, watching the reconstruction darken, fires on distant hills, roads no longer patrolled, borders no longer defended by the legions that once enforced Roman superiority. By the 5th century, The very Germanic peoples Rome had mocked for wearing trousers were no longer just soldiers within its ranks. They were kings, commanders, and rulers standing where emperors once stood. I watch Odoacer, a general of Germanic origin, step into the political vacuum left by a collapsing Rome, dressed not in a toga, but in the practical, frontier-born clothing his ancestors had worn for generations. This wasn't an invasion in the way textbooks simplify it. It was the final, inevitable result of centuries of quiet cultural absorption, one battlefield compromise, and one frozen winter at a time. I imagine the last Roman senators, wrapped in togas nobody outside the city even respected anymore, watching power shift toward men whose clothing they had once outlawed by decree. The irony is almost unbearable. Rome fell not because trousers were barbaric, but because Rome eventually needed the people who wore them more than it needed the traditions it used to define itself. What began as fabric mockery in the Forum ended as a demonstration of who truly held military, political, and cultural power across the collapsing empire. I picture the moment historians rarely dramatize: a Roman official quietly changing into practical clothing himself, abandoning the toga not out of shame, but out of sheer necessity to survive the new world forming around him. Civilization, it turns out, was never about the clothing at all. It was about which culture controlled the narrative, and by the empire's end, that narrative had completely flipped. And that's the hidden system this story was always about. Not pants, not prejudice, but how empires convince themselves they are eternal, right up until the moment their own rules are worn, quite literally, by their conquerors. Rome never fell to trousers. It fell to the illusion that clothing could contain an empire's identity forever. What started as mockery in the Forum became law, then compromise, then survival, and finally surrender, proof that cultural boundaries are borrowed, not permanent. The senators who scorned barbarian fabric couldn't see what their own soldiers already knew on frozen frontiers. Practicality outlasts pride every time. By the time Rome's rulers wore trousers themselves, the empire had already changed beyond recognition, one quiet concession at a time. So next time you see history's obvious symbols of civilization, ask what they were truly protecting and what forgotten system finally wore them down.